It's a beautiful day out there, and it's so nice to have such a lovely crowd of people here. My name is Joshua Teplitsky. I am the Ruth Meltzer Director of the Program in Jewish Studies here at the University of Pennsylvania, and it gives me great pleasure to welcome so many of you here to hear Professor Efron speak about his new book, All-Consuming: Germans, Jews, and the Meaning of Meat. Professor Efron is joining us for the Joseph Alexander Colloquium, which is the Jewish Studies program's oldest endowed lectureship. It is now in its fifth decade, which is quite impressive, and it is an intellectual touchstone and highlight of the Penn Jewish Studies academic year. This colloquium was established through the generosity of the Joseph Alexander Foundation and the Mackler family, and specifically by Helen and Alfred Mackler in memory of their late brother and uncle, and by their son Harvey Mackler, who worked to spearhead this program and to bring it to life. We're so appreciative of the Macklers, who are longstanding, loyal friends of the university in general and the Jewish Studies program in particular. We thank them for the creation of this pillar of the program and really for the opportunities that it brings to share new scholarship and fresh ideas from the wide world of Jewish studies with the Penn community, with the Philadelphia community, and far beyond. I want to also take this opportunity to thank the co-sponsors of this event, the Department of History, the Department of Francophone, Italian, and Germanic Studies, and our close friends, the Katz Center. We do everything in dialogue and partnership with one another, so thank you to all of those partners. And I want especially to take this opportunity to thank our physical hosts in this building, our colleagues and friends at the library. I want to thank Lynn Farrington, Director of Programs and Senior Curator in the Kislak Center, John Pollock, Curator of Research Services in the Kislak Center, Alicia Meyer, Curator of Research Services here, and Arthur Kiron, the Schottenstein-Jesselson Curator of Judaica Collections, as well as his wonderful staff of Judaica bibliographers and librarians. I thank them specifically because this team has put together a wonderful display of materials that relate to the contents of this book, a process that they undertook by carefully combing through the bibliography of the work itself as a gift to our speaker and to you all. So I hope that you will avail yourselves of the opportunity to take a look at the display after the talk and maybe even grab the speaker by the elbow to ask him questions about them. I should also note that copies of the book will be on sale after the talk, and we'll try to equip our speaker with a pen if you want to try to get him to sign your copy as well. I've taken up so much of his time, but I will just take a moment to actually introduce our speaker. We are really delighted to have with us a speaker who embodies the very spirit of the Alexander Colloquium, and that is Professor John Efron. Professor Efron is Koret Professor of Jewish History at the University of California, Berkeley, and is the author of numerous books dealing with themes of Jewish life and history in the German-speaking lands, although not only in those lands, exploring Jewish-Christian interaction, and in many ways, themes that run through his books are questions about the politics of belonging and deep issues of modernity in the Jewish experience. His work reflects an interest both in how Jews are seen by others and how they see themselves, and range across topics from medicine and the body to sport and satire through various genres of writing and different sorts of sources. He's a fellow of the American Academy for Jewish Research and, as mentioned, the author of numerous books. I will rattle them off because they're all so impressive and interesting. I recommend you checking them out. He's the author of the 1994 Defenders of the Race, Jewish Doctors and Race Science in Fin de Siècle Europe. The editor of co-editor of Jewish History and Jewish Memory, Essays in Honor of Yosef Chaim Yerushalmi, edited with Elisheva Karlbach and David Myers. The author of Medicine and the German Jews, A History from 2001. The co-editor of German Voices. Did I say editor? I meant author of Medicine and the German Jews, A History. The co-editor with Michael Brenner of German Voices of the Jewish 60s, the author of the 2016 German Jewry and the Allure of the Sephardic, and the co-editor with Matthias Lehmann and Stephen Weitzman of The Jews, A History, which first came out in 2009, second edition 2013, and is it true that another edition has just come out this year? Is coming out this year, but I think split into 2 volumes, if I'm understanding correctly. It's a velvet divorce of the contents of this book. And finally, of this brand new, all-consuming German Jews and the Meaning of Meat. I should also say that he's a beloved teacher. If one browses through Rate My Professor, one student writes about him, Professor Efron has the most reading I ever did for a class. 250 pages of reading per week average. That being said, Professor Efron is amazing. And I'm inclined to agree and hope you will as well. Please welcome Professor Efron.
Thank you very much. Thank you for coming. I appreciate seeing new faces, and I have a number of old friends in this room, and it's wonderful to be here. And it's also wonderful to be here in Philadelphia, not for the usual reasons that people say when they go to another city to give a talk, it's great to be here. It really is, because this book was born here at the Katz Center in the spring semester of 2016, so quite a while ago. I did some other things in between. I wasn't just loafing. And which was, without doubt, and I've said this many times before to other people, perhaps the highlight of my professional life was spending the semester here at the Katz Center under Steve's directorship. It's a brilliant and exhilarating and exciting center, and I don't have to tell you any more about it. But I want to thank Josh for the invitation, Steve, and especially Chrissy Walsh, without whom I would not be here, because she has organized this trip. So let me begin with two questions. Why write a book about meat? And why write a book about the way Germans and Jews have perceived the meat of each other, and in turn perceived each other through their meats? Now, as to the first question, put simply, meat is very important. Its consumption occasioned the first great diet change in hominins about 2.6 million years ago. And with Homo erectus, 1.8 million years ago, it played a crucial role in human development from a physiological, social, and cultural point of view. Meat has, to lesser and greater extents, been a central part of the diet of most humans throughout history. Beyond being a source of nourishment, all food, but especially meat, is rich in meanings and symbols. Indeed, whether consumed or avoided, meat carries particularly potent connotations, both positive and negative. It can engender delight as easily as it can evoke sentiments and feelings of dread. Indeed, meat might be said to be a way of ordering the world. It represents a moral, ethical, religious, ritualistic, aesthetic, gustatory, communicative, artistic, and linguistic network of ideas, practices, and attitudes. Many cultures have rules about who may eat meat and when, and which parts may be consumed, and even in what order certain parts must be eaten. Some cultures abhor meat, while others refuse some meats, but not all meat. Whatever the case, meat is universally significant. In the words of anthropologist Mary Douglas, humans and nature are always confronting each other face to face, but never more so than at the division of the meat. In Judaism, meat is of paramount importance because it constitutes the focal point of the dietary laws and serves as one of the most visible markers of Jewish distinctness and social separation. It's an object of tangible, touchable, and tasteable difference like no other. And now to my second question, why write a book about the way Germans and Jews have perceived each other's meats? And the reason is as follows. So I contend in the book that from the Middle Ages on, the meaning of meat in Germany as both an object of totem and taboo has played a crucial role in interactions between Christians and Jews, as well as among Jews. Germany offers a particularly rich backdrop against which to view the contested culture of meat and its role in the formation of ethnic identities, both German and Jewish. To an extent not seen elsewhere in Europe, in art, text, law, scholarship, politics, commerce, and popular culture, Germans have identified, thought about, studied, decried, and gladly eaten the meat of the Jews. Likewise, Jews in Germany have thought about, studied, sometimes decried, and vigorously defended their meats and the culture and rituals surrounding them by educating Germans and Jews alike about their meaning and relevance. Now, this is a story of very long duration. The book goes from the Middle Ages to the modern period, which I can't possibly cover this evening in this talk. So what I'll do this evening is focus on the modern period from about the 18th century to the 20th century. It's more than long enough. And I'll tell the story in the following way. So I've identified three themes which illustrate the intersection of meat and national or ethnic identity, all of which are specific to Germany. And they are meat and citizenship, meat and bourgeois Jewish culture, and finally, politics and the meat of the Jews. When taken together, these themes represent a substantial, though by no means exhaustive account of the story of Germans, Jews, and the meaning of meat. So first, meat and citizenship. So from the Middle Ages through to the modern period, the discourse around Christian views of Jewish meat and Jewish views of Christian meat were quite naturally deeply informed by religion in both negative and positive ways. In short, both parties were horrified by the meat of the other. However, while meat was a source and symbol of the Jewish-Christian divide, it also possessed the singular power to bring both parties together in an act of economic codependency and, ironically, courtesy of the Jewish dietary laws themselves. How so? Christians bought and still buy and eat those parts of animals the Jews eat, but those parts of the animals which are not kosher. So, for example, the rump of a cow, unless it's been purged of the sciatic nerve and certain forbidden fats called chelev. Because Jews could not discard a third of a cow, the medieval church's admonitions against Christians eating Jewish meat were honoured in the breach because the arrangement was mutually advantageous to both Jewish butchers and Christian customers. However, by the 18th century, as we start the modern period, the German discourse about meat and Jews took a more secular, let's say cultural turn. At that time, the deplorable social and economic condition of German Jewry led some Christian thinkers to begin re-evaluating the relationship of Jews to the German state. They asked a series of questions. Among them, was it possible for the Jews to be Europeanized? Did their customs befit the modern age? Did any of their religious practices preclude social integration? And finally, could the Jews be emancipated and granted German citizenship? To these questions, there were answers in both the negative and the affirmative, but unique among all countries where Jewish emancipation was debated. Meat was frequently central to the discourse in Germany, as it continued to be into the 20th century. Because of the strong anthropological element in the emancipation discourse, some Germans focused on the diet of the Jews and considered it an insurmountable barrier to their social integration. Johann David Michaelis was a renowned 18th century scholar of the Hebrew Bible and professor of Oriental languages at the University of Göttingen. He was also a dogged opponent of Jewish emancipation. Michaelis was convinced that by continuing to practice customs born in the ancient Near East, the Jews remained an Oriental people, and nothing so clearly demonstrated their unfitness for German citizenship as did their relationship to meat. In 1782, he claimed that the law of Moses was intended to maintain the separateness of Jews. As long as they refuse to eat together with us and to form sincere friendship at table, they will never become fully integrated, he wrote. Notably, this even applied to those Jews who had abandoned the dietary laws. because for having done so, Michaelis said he could not trust them. When I see a Jew eating pork, in order, no doubt, to offend his religion, then I find it impossible to rely on his word, since I cannot understand his heart. Jews, he argued, could not be made citizens because their meat would prevent them from fulfilling the most basic duties of a citizen, taking up arms to defend Germany. Quote, as long as the Jews observe the laws about kosher and non-kosher food, it will be almost impossible to integrate them into our ranks. So in short, that's what he wrote. So in short, if the Jews abandon the dietary laws and consume pork, they're not to be trusted. If they persevere in observing those laws, they seek to remain separate from the majority and cannot be relied upon to defend Germany. And we can see here, we begin to see in Germany our first illustrations of shchita, of Jewish kosher slaughter. And this is from the small Jewish community, what was a thriving Jewish community back then in Fraught, which was the town, for what it's worth, just playing the home game Henry Kissinger was from, this very small town. And this is the community slaughter yard, as you can see. And also here is the knife that is used to slaughter the animals, called a chalaf, and this is an 18th century German one. 3 years later, in 1785, Michaelis published the 4th volume of his monumental work, Mosaic Law, Mosaisches Recht. In his extended commentary on the Jewish dietary laws, Michaelis claimed that they were an invention of the Jews and thus an expression of national identity and not religious devotion. While the foodways of Europeans were also expressions of national identity, they were, he said, maintained as mere likes and dislikes. No people had drafted an entire national gastronomic constitution. Only the Jews had done that. Not only was it impossible to eat and drink with them, he said, we Jews and Germans have developed a learned disgust, Erziehungsabscheu, for the food of the other, and this is an obstacle to fostering closer familiarity. Referring to the ribboned rosettes that soldiers in his day wore as an identifying mark, the dietary laws were, quite simply, quote, a cockade for the Israelites, unquote. Thus we come full circle. Jews, quiet Jews, could not serve in the Prussian army, and this is because, armed with their dietary laws, they already formed an army of their own. And nothing sort of illustrates more the sort of the distinctness and the separateness and the non-Germanness from Michaelis's point of view, as this is a bowl for serving meat, and it says there in Hebrew, Basar Yom Tov, initials for Yom Tov there. This happens to be in the Magnus Museum, which is a wonderful Jewish museum in Berkeley, and it's on display there. Like Michaelis, Christoph Meiners was a professor in the School of History at Göttingen. In a discussion of Moses' division of animals into the categories of clean and unclean, Meiners elided ancient Israelites and modern Jews in a most seamless fashion. He would not be the only one to do so. Moses, he observed, forbade the Jews from eating many animals or parts of animals, deeming them unclean, which were, without question, healthier than the goose and goose fat which Jews in such great numbers enjoy today. Just as a point which might sound amusing, but goose was a beloved animal among Jews, but it was also a necessary animal among Jews, because where Christians had lard as a cooking oil, Jews used goose fat. It was the absolute equivalent of lard. So it was an essential item as well. Worst of all, their dietary self-segregation, according to Christoph Meiners, manifested itself in the Jews' refusal to eat pork, Germany's Lieblingsfleisch, its favorite meat. It was, he suggested, tantamount to a rejection of the Germans themselves. Jews in Germany were also concerned about their meat and its relationship to citizenship and social integration. In the 19th century, this followed two tracks. The first ran along the lines of debating whether the dietary laws remained relevant, a subject of particular significance for Reform Judaism. There were voices pro and con. Perhaps even more heated was the subject of temple sacrifice, which, after all, is largely about meat. Both the newly founded Reform and Neo-Orthodox streams took up the matter. Given the slow and uneven process of emancipation in Germany, Jews made repeated and strenuous efforts to modernize Jewish culture, with many believing that the synagogue had a crucial role, a central role to play in the transformation of the Jews. If that was to be the case, a particularly thorny issue was the liturgy, specifically the prayer of Musaf, the additional prayer said on Shabbat, Yom Tov, and Chol Hamoed and Rosh Chodesh. Musaf commemorates the additional sacrifices that were offered in the ancient temple in Jerusalem on those days. In its various versions, Musaf calls for the return of the Jews to their ancestral homeland, reconstruction of the temple, and the restoration of animal sacrifice. In the very first Reform prayer book introduced at the First Reformed Temple in Hamburg in 1818, the Musaf was replaced with a petition that prayer be accepted instead of sacrifice. May it be your will, O Lord, our God and God of our fathers, to receive in mercy and favor the expression of our lips in place of obligatory sacrifices. There were those who were satisfied with the innovation at Hamburg, while others suggested alternate solutions. One was to declare, quote, our spirit surrenders to God. It soars without mediation toward the Spirit of God, unquote. Another proposal recommended saying Musaf silently, while yet another suggested the prayer could be said aloud, but only in Hebrew, perhaps in recognition of the fact that neither Germans nor most congregants could understand it. As for Neo-Orthodoxy, it would not countenance any change in the liturgy. However, like Reformed Jews, the Neo-Orthodox were also imbued with the values of the Enlightenment and middle-class German culture. This meant that, like Reform, Neo-Orthodoxy could not petition for the return of animal sacrifice. To do so would have been barbaric, undermining the quest for citizenship. The leading figure of Neo-Orthodoxy was Samson Raphael Hirsch. His response to the dilemma of retaining the Musaf while rejecting sacrifice was to explain sacrifice as being part of a symbolic system and not a literal, potentially living practice. Quote, the ability to express ideas by physically perceptible signs or symbols is as natural and as necessary to man as are the ability and the urge to communicate ideas by means of spoken, audible words. Sacrifice was precisely one of those physically perceptible signs. And because the ideas behind Judaism's symbols were eternally binding, the idea of sacrifice remained as relevant in Hirsch's day as it was when the temple still stood. Christians, too, sought to take account of animal sacrifice in ancient Israel. Beginning in the 18th century and developing over the course of the 19th century, Protestant scholars in Germany founded the modern academic field of biblical criticism. The towering figure in this enterprise was Julius Wellhausen. He was concerned with the authorship and compilation of the Hebrew Bible and argued that the Pentateuch had its origins in 4 separate texts that he dated to several centuries after the time of Moses. His historicization of Judaism led him to argue that instead of being a creation of Israelite religion in its earliest phase, the ceremonial law by which he meant animal sacrifice was a very late development. As such, Judaism did not follow a normal evolutionary pattern, beginning in primitive fashion and later evolving into a humane, ethically guided religious culture. He concluded that Judaism was, quote, an irregular product of history, The ideal of holiness governs the whole of life by means of a net of ceremonies and observances which separate the Jew from the natural man. Wellhausen was a Protestant supersessionist, in case you hadn't noticed, a German nationalist who believed in Israel's radically distinct national identity. His claim that Israel had abandoned prophetic ethics in favor of the late adoption of a priestly cult centered on animal sacrifice must be seen against the backdrop of the larger contemporary debate over national identities in modern Germany. Now, here's my second category: meat and bourgeois Jewish culture. After being legally emancipated in 1871, German Jewry sought to acculturate, but not assimilate, a process that concludes with disappearance. In Germany, resistance to disappearing came courtesy of religion, intra-marriage, class and profession-based affinity, and, of course, anti-Semitism played a very large role. However, if the resistance movement had a headquarters, a place where it could hunker down and fend off the forces of assimilation, it was the home kitchen. There, the Jewish diet, linked as it was to the Jewish calendar, was an important component of what it meant to be a German Jew. That diet tells us much about Jewish social and economic advancement, as well as Jewish bourgeois tastes and culture. Over the course of the 19th century, German meat consumption tripled, and by 1910, Germans ate on average 114 pounds of meat per annum. 65% of all of that meat consumed in Germany was pork. Now, while there are no statistics for Jews, it's safe to surmise that the total meat consumption by Jews in Germany would have looked very much like the national average, perhaps even a bit more, except, of course, for pork consumption. As such, by the 19th century, meat was central to German Jewish cooking and identity. And there are numerous sources in different genres that allow us to make such a claim. There are odes to German Jewish cuisine by authors who memorialize their most beloved. Second, early 20th century German Jewish scholarship, which created the field of Jewish food ethnography, history, and folklore, has much to teach us. And third, there are kosher cookbooks. And let's begin with the odes. I'll focus on the odes and the cookbooks. The poet and writer Heinrich Heine was a passionate devotee of Ashkenazic cuisine. In particular, a dish German Jews called Charlotte, better known as Chulent, about which he waxed rhapsodic. In his epic poem, The Princess Sabbath, the miserable experience of the Jewish peddler's week, wherein he had been treated like a dog, sees him transformed by the arrival of the Sabbath and the Charlotte, so integral to the peddler's revival. Charlotte is the food of heaven, and the recipe was given by the Lord himself to Moses one fine day upon Mount Sinai. Charlotte is God's bread of rapture. It is the kosher ambrosia that is catered straight from heaven. And compared with such a morsel, the ambrosia of the pagan pseudo-gods of ancient Hellas, who were devils in disguise, is just a pile of devil's dreck. Heine's expression of culinary nationalism was more than matched by his contemporary, Moritz Gottlieb Safir. Born near Budapest and educated first at renowned yeshivas in Pressburg and Prague, in his early years, Safir was exposed to secular culture, studied European literature, and learned English, German, and Romance languages. Like Heine, Safir loved Jewish food, and like Heine, he wrote of that love. He wrote in an essay in 1847 entitled The Gastronomy of the Jews, or Vogel's Restaurant, Recollections of My Youth, which appeared in 2 installments in a magazine he began called The Humorist. It is a bitingly funny essay, and Safir tells us that Vogel's Restaurant, quote, awoke in my stomach the memories of youth, which are called cravings, and those cravings are for the flesh pots of Egypt, which in my stomach were cravings and dreams of Chulent and Kugel. Chulent, he said, was more than a Sabbath dish. It represented a system. In fact, Chulent is like the fate of the Jew. Citizenship is not conferred by a cookbook, and it doesn't go with other dishes, rolled by fate like barley, like peas gnawed by every worm, like dried meat hung in the chimney of the zeitgeist, on the whole bold, abundant, and poignant. In addition to their mutual love of Chulent, Heine and Safir also shared another sentiment. Both men derided modern Jews, despite being modern Jews, preferring instead what Safir called Stockjuden, or traditional Jews. The traditional Jew, wrote Safir, is candid. He stands up straight and says, I am a Jew, while only modern Jews bow and scrape, bending this way and that, switching sides if one way doesn't suit or is too uncomfortable. Safir wrote this some 17 years after he had converted to Protestantism, and a mere 5 years after Heine had done the same thing. He writes self-consciously about his conversion and its relationship to his ongoing desire for Jewish food. Jewish national foods, to comprehend them, one must be a scholar. To describe them, a genius. And to enjoy them with a benediction, a Jew. But to honor them, one must be a meshumad, a convert. To prove the point, Safir became one of his favorite foods, and thus he declared, a bastard born of Chulent, namely the kugel, is a ganef. Let me explain. In the Charlotte in Germany, the kugel was actually cooked inside the Chulent, right? Inside the casserole itself, right? And why is it called a ganef? It's not an invention of Safir's term. It was a very common use of the term among German Jews. And what was it? It was an ennobled kugel, is what he writes. And when it is united with the aroma of the Chulent, the ganef is a thief. It is called a ganef because of its gestalt, a raw mass of flour in the middle of a sealed pot of rice, beans, goose breast, goose liver, and other delicacies. It steals the aroma, that's hence the ganef. It steals the aroma and the taste of everything else around it in order to make itself its own. And then, as a transformed mensch, endowed with all of its foreign characteristics, it emerges alive from the pot. Safir is the ganef he celebrates, or perhaps eulogizes. He started out as a bland, unformed mass and then took on, or did he steal, like a ganef, non-Jewish culture and all the qualities and characteristics that made him who he had become. A convert, to be sure, but still never more Jewish than when in the Chulent pot. Where Bildung is the German word for self-cultivation through education, the 19th century memorialization of and instruction in how to prepare Jewish foods was a form of culinary Bildung. Kosher cookbooks, and Germany was the first country to publish them, served as guides to the acquisition of a new Jewish culinary self-awareness. Almost exclusively written by women, and there are some on display in the next room there, and I urge you afterwards, not now, but afterwards, to go and look at them. Almost exclusively written by women, they were a new Jewish literary genre. They became especially popular between 1850 and 1910, and while not all the recipes were intended for daily fare, because many were far too elaborate, the cookbooks reveal an ideal, a goal that a respectable middle-class Jewish family should strive for. As such, they are valuable historical sources. German Jewish kosher cookbooks were ostentatiously large. The smallest volume that I found had about 300 recipes. The largest, Marie Elsasser's, which is in there, called Detailed Cookbook for Basic and Refined Jewish Cooking, had a massive 3,759 recipes. The plenitude of the German Jewish table depicted in these cookbooks was reflected and symbolic of lives no longer lived on the margins. In their own way, they were an homage to a land of plenty. More than this, they were sometimes apologia. Philip Muntz, a physician and scion of a distinguished family of Orthodox rabbis, published 2 substantial essays in leading medical journals on the therapeutic advantages of the dietary laws. Long and technical, both essays served as the foreword to Berta Gumprich's complete practical cookbook of Jewish cuisine, Germany's most popular cookbook. The essays appeared in every edition from the first in 1888 until the last in 1925. One of the earliest cookbooks, we do not know the author's name, appeared in Vienna in 1854. It was entitled A New and Complete Cookbook of Jewish Cuisine. It has the distinction of being the world's first published Yiddish cookbook. Being in Yiddish did not mean that this anonymous cookbook wasn't aimed at middle-class Jewish women. It surely was. And for this, we have visual proof from the front cover. You see this illustration of two obviously bourgeois women cooking together, most likely a mother and daughter, as indicated in the book's title. And in the foreground, the daughter holds an open weave metal grate over a fire in which she is grilling liver to kosher it, to make it kosher. Right? You can see it there. And it's of note that there were still significant numbers of middle class Jewish women in 19th century Vienna who were still more comfortable reading the Hebrew alphabet than the Latin one. Appearing in 1851, Rebecca Wolf's, which is also in here, I might add, Arthur did a fantastic job in putting this together. Thank you so much. Appearing in 1851, Rebecca Wolf's Cookbook for Jewish Women was a bestseller that appeared in 14 editions, the last one that appeared in Frankfurt in 1933. Many of her dishes are standard Ashkenazic fare, and so it's noteworthy that despite the vast cultural and socio-economic gulf that had opened up between East European and German Jews, one could find the same different versions of exactly the same dishes at a Sabbath or a Passover table of Jews in Koblenz and Krakow and Mannheim and Minsk and Berlin and Brody. All the German Jewish cookbooks had meat recipes that were likewise eaten further east. That said, the foods were not identical. Eastern European Jews were unlikely to prepare a dish called rabbit from minced meat, even if it was just a meatloaf of kosher meat formed in the shape of a rabbit. Nor would they be seen eating mock turtle soup. Eastern European Jews were unlikely to eat foods with names such as goose liver à la Strasbourg, kidneys in Madeira sauce, bœuf à la mode, or Bordeaux tongue in Bordeaux wine. In Germany, the general view of French cooking was that it was superior and came with an approbation by virtue of its place of origin. To prepare something French style, nach französischer Art, was part of the acquisition and practice of culinary Bildung, as well as an expression of bourgeois cosmopolitanism. Another point of difference from Jewish cooking further east is that 19th century meat recipes in German Jewish cookbooks actually have echoes of medieval cooking techniques. A typical French cooking method of serving food at court in the Middle Ages involved the elaborate process of deconstructing, stuffing, and reconstructing an animal, and then presenting it at table in a most elaborate and colorful display. In Berta Gumprich's complete practical cookbook of Jewish cuisine, her recipe for turkey in aspic, or in Gumprich's Germano-Gallic rendering, Truthahn à la gelatine, was just such a dish. The instructions tell the reader that after the turkey had been made kosher, it is to be spatchcocked, that is cut from head to tail along its back, and when the entire carcass is exposed, the bird is to be deboned. Wings, legs, and all the flesh must remain in one piece. The boneless carcass is then stuffed with a forcemeat of minced veal, beef, heart, liver, shallots, and onions, salt, pepper, nutmeg, pickled cucumbers, truffles, turnips, pistachios, and olives. The whole turkey is to be then sewn up, trussed, and bound between two boards, which are then lowered into a very large warm water bath to poach gently. When done, the fire is to be turned off and the turkey is allowed to sit in the water until it is cooled. It is then to be removed and decorated with the aspic that formed during the cooking process. The aspic is dyed in various colors and cut into strips and placed all over the turkey to simulate its feathering. Spectacular and historically rich, turkey in aspic is to be served, she said, with either a compote or a mustard sauce. Gumprich's book exemplifies just how central meat was to the German Jewish diet. In the 9th edition, that appeared in 1925, there are a staggering 61 beef dishes, 41 veal dishes, 10 lamb dishes, and 24 poultry dishes. In addition, there are 58 soup recipes with either a meat-derived soup base or a broth made using some kind of animal fat. Similarly, 79 of her vegetable dishes were made with meat. And in a separate section dedicated to potato recipes, 19 of them were made with meat or animal fat. Even desserts, such as her Passover recipe for apple cake, called for 2 tablespoons of fat taken from the top of the chicken soup after it had congealed, or goosschmaltz. Now, the last category is meat and the politics of the Jews. In the 19th century, the meat of the Jews became political fodder in Germany. As meat went from being a luxury to a staple, new vegetarian societies popped up everywhere in response to the changing German diet. Uniquely, vegetarianism in Germany was also part of a much larger movement, one that recoiled at the perceived excesses of the bourgeoisie and its prodigious meat consumption. A loose collection of teetotalers, anti-smokers, clothing reformers, advocates of organic farming and naturopathic medicine, nudists, anti-vaccination and anti-vivisection campaigners, vegetarians, hiking groups, and adherents of Eastern spirituality all came together to form a vibrant social movement known as the Lebensreform, the life reform movement. The movement was not the domain of any one class and attracted members from across the social and religious spectrum. However, one strain of the life reform movement was its implacably anti-Semitic wing. Committed to vegetarianism, it followed the philosopher Schopenhauer, who in his essay on the basis of morality in 1840 denounced those, quote, who pretended that beasts have no rights, that we have no duties towards animals, a doctrine revolting, gross, and barbarous, peculiar to the West, and which has its roots in Judaism. Among the adherents of this line of thought was the influential Bayreuth circle gathered around their hero, the composer Wagner, who Hitler would later credit with being the inspiration for his own vegetarianism. Yeah. That's not what I was looking for. Okay, one second. So it's in this cultural climate that an unholy alliance of animal protection societies and anti-Semitic political parties prosecuted a relentless campaign to ban kosher animal slaughter, which forbids stunning the animal before slaughter. It was decried as cruel, inhumane, and a typically bloodthirsty Jewish rite. And it even accused Jews of taking particular delight in the slaughter of animals. And in this cartoon, we can see here the Jew likes to play the butcher. For his pleasure, he wallows in meat. The campaign was more intense, more organized, and more long-lived in Germany than anywhere else in Europe. Of course, the charges of animal cruelty rang hollow, considering contemporary non-Jewish modes of slaughter, which included devices such as this, Renger's slaughter machine, Schlachtmaschine there. This is Arthur Stoff's bolt gun. This is Arthur Stoff was a supplier to abattoirs of various methods. They were constantly trying to invent ways to kill animals more efficiently. And this sort of very elegant Bruno mask, which is speaks for itself. Now, what is noteworthy about Germany is the failure of the campaign against kosher slaughter. And it wasn't for lack of trying. It was relentless, absolutely relentless, and incredibly energetic, non-stop, and yet it failed. From the 1880s, time and again, it met with defeat, thanks to the intense lobbying efforts of the Jews and their allies in the Reichstag, liberals, social democrats, and the Catholic Centre Party, all of whom grounded their opposition to the anti-Semites upon Germany's constitutional guarantee of religious freedom. Such was the case for years. However, beginning around 1925, with Nazis now sitting in state parliaments, they took up the losing cause again and began to enjoy success at the local level, state level. Still, the goal had always been a national ban. And after Hitler became chancellor, the opponents of kosher slaughter did not have to wait long. The ban on the slaughter of animals without stunning was decreed on April the 21st, 1933. It's a measure of how important the banning of kosher slaughter was that it was a mere 11 weeks after he assumed the chancellorship. passage of such a law should have been the end of the matter. Instead, it was only the beginning. As a performative rite, kosher animal slaughter was tailor-made for Nazi propaganda. Not only was it deemed inhuman and radically un-German, but it could also be depicted graphically and in especially lurid ways. And there was no one more enthusiastic about bombarding the Germans with indelibly grotesque images of kosher slaughter than Julius Streicher, the most notorious anti-Semitic publisher in Hitler's Germany. The images were seen by large numbers of people, huge numbers. By 1938, his paper, Der Stürmer, reached a peak circulation of 476,000 copies per week. And they would have seen pictures such as this, right? So this is protect yourself against Jewish exploitation, and this is speaks for itself. But it's a Jewish husband and wife who are butchers, and he says, you know, what do you want with a cat? Catch me a rat, and I'll put it in the hack machine, in the mincer. The guy eats everything just so long as it's cheap, right? That's the slogan there. The Gift Pilz was a book published by Streicher, and it is a children's book. And in here we see how the Jews torment animals. The animal fell to the ground. Slowly it died. The Jews stood around and laughed. And this picture is very reminiscent, just in its choreography, the way it's set out, of that very first picture of the animal slaughter yard in Fraught synagogue. So it's always, you know, which wasn't as tendentious like this, but the animal lies prone in the middle of the picture, and here are the Jews standing around and enjoying themselves. Elvira Bauer, who wrote this book, was a 19-year-old primary school teacher who wrote this stunningly anti-Semitic children's book entitled Trust No Fox on His Green Heath and No Jew on His Oath. It appeared in 1936, published by the Stürmer Verlag, the publishing house. And here we see there's a whole bunch of scenes, but one of the scenes is about the Jewish cattle dealer. And here the cattle dealer, you'll see here the cattle dealer has just made a killing, and he's walking off, very self-satisfied, typically self-satisfied features, walking off self-satisfied, and the Jew, you know, the poor innocent German farmers holding his head saying, oh my God, what's just happened to me? I'm ruined, I'm destitute. And the Jew is sort of walking off with all of his cattle and other animals as well. And this one is particularly interesting. This is called Once a Jew, Always a Jew. And this is the story of this. And there's a story that goes with it, and I'll read this to you. So this guy here on the left is Itzik Ephraim, who was converted to Catholicism. And now he goes by the name of Gotthilf Joachim Friedrichus Christian Itzik. He's rich, fat, and gluttonous, and he sits alone at dinner when a priest walks in on him and is scandalized to see Itzik eating meat. And you'll notice here, it's Friday. You see the Magen David with the calendar just underneath it that says Freitag. And here we see sort of the Jew has magical properties. And this is because of the text that follows. Itzik responds, he says to the priest, what you see upon my table, it is no goose, it is just a fish. I bought myself a gosling and wanted to christen this tasty dish. On this roast I pronounced, you were a goose, you are now a fish. Now, children, take a look at the Jew. Do you think that he can change and be like you when he has been baptized, 5 buckets of water over the crown of his head, yet nothing about him is changed anew? This you should all well know. Once a Jew, always a Jew. here's another one from Elvira Bauer, and this is a picture of the Jewish butcher, and the Jewish butcher is depicted here as, you know, hirsute with a red nose, overweight, filthy apron, and juxtaposed with this, you know, fresh-faced, spick and span clean Aryan mother and child in this filthy butcher shop. And in the display, there's part of a 4-volume work on Jewish sort of customs by Johann Jakob Schutt, who was an 18th century ethnographer, among other things, right? And he has a chapter on the stench of the Jews. This is one of his chapter titles. And the archetypal Jew is his description of the butcher with the filthy apron, covered in feces, covered in blood, and just a wretched figure. And this has echoes. This has real echoes of what was a very long-standing ethnographic trope in Germany. So the Nazis went beyond film. They went beyond picture books for children and the Stürmer, the magazine for adults, but to films. And this is a film that was made in 1940 by Goebbels called Der ewige Jude, the Eternal Jew. And this is a film that goes for 59 minutes, and they have a full 7-minute Schritter scene, which is a very long time in a film that's just under an hour. And it's all theatrically done. They all parade in, holding up these huge knives, and it's a ridiculous thing. And then you see a prolonged slow death scene of the animal. This scene was actually filmed in the Lodz ghetto. So they organized it. So this is right in the middle of the Holocaust, and these people here in the ghetto would have been dispatched to their deaths. This is a cattle dealer from the Black Forest, as you can see, and you can see the way he's attired. The cattle dealer becomes a major figure. The cattle, why is the cattle? Because there were still, even up until the 1930s, considerable numbers of rural Jews in Germany, and considerable numbers of Jewish cattle dealers. And the heaviest concentration of cattle dealers were in Franconia, in Franken. And the Gauleiter of Franconia was none other than Julius Streicher. And so he was obsessed with the Jewish cattle dealer. So this is what a Jewish cattle dealer, a normative Jewish cattle dealer at the time looked like. But the Nazis, you see that they were made the object of ridicule at carnival time. So this is carnival in Mannheim in 1939, where this guy is dressed, non-Jew, dressed as a Jew with a fake beard. Let's see, sort of a closer shot. This is what he looks like. There's money coming out of his top pocket. And it's also noteworthy, I think, that you'll see them standing there with umbrellas. The rain doesn't deter them. People are laughing. They're having a very, very good time. So this obsession with, it's not just meat, but it's the cattle dealers, it's the merchants, etc. And this is their sense of what a Jewish cattle dealer, even though they saw them and they looked more like the guy in the bowler hat, dressed like a standard bourgeois man from the 1920s. This is the way they chose to depict him. Now, there's much more to this story of the Jews and meat in Nazi Germany. Walter Darré was the Nazi Minister of Agriculture and Peasant Leader. And he was the chief ideologist of the regime's blood and soil, the Blut- doctrine. During his agricultural studies, he became convinced that in the cultural and natural history of mankind, there was a connection between human races and certain domestic animal species. And in 1927, he published an article entitled "The Pig as a Criterion for Nordic People and Semites." Predictably, he speaks of the cultural and agri-racial affinity between Nordic peoples and pigs, both of which he said enjoyed a settled way of life and were unsuited to a nomadic existence. The Jews, being nomadic, were not only averse to pigs, but they had also codified their hatred in the dietary laws. And that background is important for what follows. So fast forward 10 years into 1937, and Daré publishes a book called Der Schweinemord, The Genocide of the Pigs, or the Massacre of the Pigs, the thesis of which is as follows. Back in 1914, an early frost, this is true, this did happen, there was an early frost, fertilizer shortages, and no access to imported fodder because of an embargo around Germany. German farmers illegally fed potatoes and grain to their animals. And those crops were the dietary staples of the German poor. In response to the looming food crisis, the government put together the Elsbacher Commission, a panel of experts charged with drafting a plan. Remember, the war was only supposed to last 7 weeks. They had no forward planning whatsoever. Drafting a plan for food production and consumption during wartime. Led by the Berlin professor Paul Elsbacher, the commission's report identified pigs as co-eaters, Mitfresser, with humans, which competing with humans for valuable food. And the experts calculated that the number of potatoes it took to feed 10 million pigs could feed 64 million Germans. As such, the Elsbacher Commission called for the slaughter of between 9 and 10 million pigs. And so it came to pass. For Walter Daré, the Great Pig Massacre was not a consequence of bureaucratic incompetency, as most others saw it, and it was decried at the time. Rather, it was the product of a deliberate Jewish conspiracy. The evidence, given what Daré had long believed about Aryans, Jews, and pigs, it stood to reason that there had been a porcine genocide, given that Elsbacher and other members of the commission were Jewish. After all, in 1914, Elsbacher had declared, "Today, pigs are our greatest enemy." Daré read Elsbacher's declaration as a criminal confession and considered the commission named after him as little more than a gathering of the elders of Zion, plotting to starve the Germans to death by denying them their Lieblingsfleisch, their favorite meat, right, pork. It was very, very similar to what we'd seen in the 18th century, an accusation by Christoph Meiners, the historian. From the Jewish perspective, life in Nazi Germany, as soon as the April 1933 ban came into effect, hundreds of kosher butchers lost their jobs, hundreds of kosher butcher shops shut down. Desperate advertisements appeared in the Orthodox press in particular from butchers looking for work. Until 1938, Jews were permitted to buy kosher meat that came from Holland or Denmark, and after that date, even that was no longer permissible. Surreptitiously, there was a lot of illicit kosher slaughter, especially poultry, but red meat was almost impossible to come by. The community was deeply, deeply distressed, especially about the fate of the elderly and the sick, because at this time, remember, medical science and thus popular culture as well, considered meat to be the most important and irreplaceable source of protein. There was nothing else. In real terms, the denial of meat was part of the Nazis' deliberate policy of privation. In symbolic terms, eating meat was a daily habit and a symbol of their bourgeois lives and culture, and it was yet another thing stolen from German Jewry. Now to conclude. For Christians and Jews in Germany, but especially for Jews at the level of daily life, meat was extremely important as a source of nourishment, as both a symbol and fact of religious distinctiveness, as a trigger for nostalgic reflection, as inspiration for historical and scholarly interest, as a marker of middle-class tastes and aspirations, as an expression of Germanness in both an Aryan and a kosher key. To bring the story to a conclusion and closer to our time, the heirs of those forces that once led the fight against kosher animal slaughter today have their sights trained on halal slaughter. When they began to settle in Germany in the 1960s, Muslims by and large bought kosher meat. In 1979, the Berlin Administrative Court recognized the right of Muslims to perform halal slaughter. However, with the growth of Germany's Muslim population, their religious customs came under greater scrutiny and attitudes to halal slaughter began to harden. And in 1982, a German meat company applied for an exemption from stunning animals prior to slaughter. Their petition explicitly sought parity with kosher slaughter, and the court's judgment was as surprising as it was ironic. I would say chutzpahdik, but nonetheless, and this is what the court says: the permission for Jews to slaughter represents an act of political, cultural, and humanitarian compensation to the Jews who are still alive. The Jewish religion has in Germany a greater historical tradition than the Muslims. Jews have more or less integrated into the German people as Germans with essentially the same rights and duties. Other courts followed suit, arguing that where Muslim practices were foreign, Germany was a Judeo-Christian country and Jews had lived there for centuries, hence Jewish slaughter practices were as good as native to the land. There is no other food like meat. Reactions to it can be visceral. With other foods, one either likes them or not, can tolerate them or not. Meat is different. Inanimate as it nonetheless has character and personality because it came from a living creature that we killed to get it. Studying Germans, Jews, and their respective understanding of meat and its many meanings, we are provided via a single commodity with a unique and revealing way of approaching the rich, fraught, and ultimately tragic history of German Jewry. In the end, we may paraphrase Mary Douglas and assert that the story I've told you this evening is about the way Germans and Jews always confronted each other face to face, but never more so than at the division of meat. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for that wonderful, well-delivered talk. We have time for questions. While people are gathering questions, I might take prerogative to also just throw a question your way. I was so delighted to see that you showed us not just meat itself, but also all of the objects and accoutrements that you moved to.
Yeah.
It was the knife or the kosher bowl, and virtually every image that you showed was populated with utensils of different sorts. Did the sources that you looked at allow you to delve into questions about the purchase of multiple sets of dishes, or the decor of those dishes, or the distinctiveness of what Jewish dishes might look like, or their similitude to their neighbors' dishes?
Yeah. So two things. So one of the things that another one of the things that Michaela said and Minus spoke specifically about the absurdity of how many dishes Jews have, how many pans they have. And similarly, in the late 19th century, one of the scions of a very, very well-established German Jew who came from a long line of who had come from a long line of court Jews and was arguing against getting rid of shechita, and he was an extremely wealthy man, said that this is driving Jews into poverty. The decking out of a kosher kitchen costs a fortune. So some of the things that you hear today about it's expensive to be a Jew. I mean, it is expensive to keep a kosher kitchen, is of long standing. And so we get these descriptions, both negative from the Christian side, but some of them negative from the Jewish side, that it's just a very difficult thing for people to make ends meet and keep kosher. So there are these references, yeah.
Thank you so much for the talk. It seems to me that you have talked about three very different things.
Yeah.
One is butchering.
Mm-hmm.
So that is a Jewish ritual of kosher butchering that can be identified to Jewish practice, law, and so on.
Yes.
And seen then in anti-Semitic caricatures and description as violent and so on and so forth. The second category is the cattle dealers.
Yeah.
That's something totally different.
Yeah.
Because to trade cattle was a profession permitted for Jews.
Yeah.
And the cattle wasn't just traded among Jews.
Right.
This is much more sticky because, as you have pointed out by showing the dress of the cattle dealer, one doesn't know Jew or not Jew, but certainly the meat is eaten by Jews and not Jews.
Right.
So the point there is to make the distinction that is not yet there, to make them particularly Jewish. The third category is the meat. And there we are in a little bit of a slippery slope, because on the one hand, the meat consumption is high in Germany in general.
Yeah.
So that's a
Yeah.
country of meat eaters.
Yeah.
And when you quote somebody like Michaelis, you have two issues here. One is the actual meat, and one is what I may call meat as a shibboleth, meat as a sign, foresight. He could also say Jews can't become soldiers because they keep Shabbat. Jews can't become soldiers because they're physically not able. All of this was said. But if you say meat, you give a signal. And so I wonder, when did meat become the signal? And the signal is there already with the dishes in Heine. When you quote Heine as loving Schollen, of course, the guy loved Schollen.
Yeah.
But that's not the point. He was scandalizing by putting it in the poetry. And he was scandalizing by meeting converts like Salomon Bartholdi and asking somebody who tried so hard to be a Christian, how did you like your Schollen yesterday? Didn't you eat it? And that was a scandal. So it becomes a password. And so I wonder what we do with meat as a metaphor or a shibboleth, and meat as a practical dish. And quoting the cookbooks and quoting Heine blurs the line between both, and I just wanted to separate it again, if possible.
Well, look, we have two cultures here who are very meat-centric, which is what makes Germany so interesting and so different from anywhere else. Right? We don't have, it's a shibboleth. Yes, you can say it's a shibboleth. That's fine. I mean, look, only one chapter of the book is actually about food itself, right? That, and I quoted extensively from these cookbooks. It's meat as metaphor, it's meat as symbol. You call it shibboleth. Okay, that's fine. I accept that. It's shorthand. But, you know, put it this way, Michaelis said that they can't serve in the army because they can't eat non-kosher food, right? This is what he said. Now, that would be true for some people back then. It would have been not true for others, but the other ones, he accounted for them. If they ate treif, he didn't want anything to do with them. They're not to be trusted. So there was always a way of sort of manipulating the evidence, as it were. As far as the cattle dealers are concerned, I'm not sure what the question was. You had a statement, but I'm not sure what the question was.
Is that there are some issues like kosher butchering, which are definitely.
So yes,
is the uncanny about cattle dealers is that you don't always see whether they're Jew.
Yes, you do.
And but you eat the meat.
No, that's not right. That's not right. They were identifiably Jewish because they spoke their own language. They spoke a language called.
Sold to non-Jews.
No, in the cattle markets, they spoke a language called Lachudish, which is their way of saying Loshen Kodesh, and it was a Germanic Hebraic mix,
which was adopted by the Christian cattle dealers.
Yes, some of them could exactly, but they absolutely knew who was Jewish and who wasn't. First of all, these are small town people, right, in villages and very small cities. Everyone knew who was Jewish and who wasn't Jewish. There's no blurring. Absolutely no blurring. The Nazis had problems with the cattle dealers because it's a business that was built on long-standing trust, bonds of trust. And the Nazis actually had trouble in breaking those bonds. They eventually succeeded, but it wasn't as quick as, say, the bonds that were broken between Christian doctors, between doctors and patients, other professions, and Jewish professionals and other Aryans that they were able to sort of get rid of overnight. When not with the doctors, but they were able to get rid of other professions overnight. The civil service on April 7th, 1933, they chucked all the Jews out of the civil service in one night. That was it. But this was different. So you had the bonds that formed just by virtue of living in very close proximity in very small communities, plus the nature of the business itself. It was done on a handshake. It wasn't written contracts. So it would be wrong to see them as unidentifiable. They were very identifiable, and it wasn't a problem for most of the butchers, for most of them. But Walter Darré, who was the Minister of Agriculture, worked very, very hard to help effect a break between the Jewish cattle dealers and the non-Jewish cattle dealers. And at the end of the day, as would happen with the professions, with medicine and law in particular, all those positions, all those jobs were taken. They were stolen. And at the end of the day, there was profit to be had, right? So it was profit to be had by getting the doctors off the national healthcare registry, where every doctor was allocated a certain number of patients. You're guaranteed a very good living. And it's why it's why the German Medical Association, for example, was the most easily and eagerly Nazified of any professional group, because they were there for the pickings. And once those positions were taken, both at university to become a medical student and also then thereafter to have a whole roster of patients sort of handed to you, you were set. You were set for life, as it were. And similarly, at the end of the day, those reluctant Christian cattle dealers who didn't want to break relations saw the light. First of all, it's a coercive regime as well, but aside from that, there was something in it for them. They get all that business that now the Jewish cattle dealers can't engage in. So that determined their attitude.
There's Sasha in the last round of question, and then Louis, did you have a question? Yeah.
Hi, I have two questions. The first is, and this is a bit of a kosher elephant in the room, I suppose, but what—
I'm sorry, you have to speak up.
I said I have two questions. The first is kind of the kosher elephant in the room, but what is the role of dairy in your book? Is it something that proves to be more of a unifying symbol because it's easier to share, or perhaps, I think about like the sanctity of the German milkmaid and as something that like symbolizes virginity and perhaps as a result also is out of bounds for German Jews. And my second question is about the role of the beer house, because I think about the ways in which sausage is often paired with beer and the way in which these spaces were essential to the German public sphere, the development of the German public sphere throughout the 19th centuries, and the ways in which Jews might have been left out of that process because of the sausage traditionally paired with beer.
You don't kill anything to get dairy, to the best of my non-farming knowledge. So it's just not as loaded. And they can share that, they can share that for the most part. It's not an issue. It's not an issue. Or in the 20th century, Orthodox Jews did go to beer halls, particularly in Bavaria on Saturday afternoons. They would go. They would have paid beforehand, like on Friday or something like that. And they took their own food and they ate at those. They ate in beer gardens. So it was a way of acculturating and being part of the crowd, and yet remaining, dietarily observant. So that didn't prove to be a barrier. for those who wanted to observe, kashrut.
Thank you so much. So I was particularly curious about the role of the animal rights movement before the Nazi period in the late century, and this opposition to Shrita, in a world in which even if Jews and Germans are not eating the same type of meat, they're both massive meat consumers, and as you pointed out, right, for all the issues around Shrita or potential issues or manipulations around Shrita, there's plenty of practices to critique in terms of late 19th century and early 20th century German practices. So to what extent did the animal rights movement, how much was it really focused only on Shrita as a form of sort of anti-Semitic vitriol? And to what extent do we actually see also opposition to German practices and German and sort of non-Jewish ways of killing animals? And sort of more to the point, are those two separate movements? Is this sort of one singular opposition that also has an anti-Semitic element, or are these really two separate?
It was almost singularly focused on Shrita, with the with the demand that animals be stunned first, and of course the first country to get rid of to ban Shrita was Switzerland. Still the case. In Switzerland and in Germany, none of these animal rights groups ever demanded an end to hunting.
Interesting.
Ever. So it was almost a singularly anti-Semitic, and also, if you look at the political sources who formed common cause with them, they were members of the anti-Semitic parties.
Interesting.
So they were in it together. Yeah. There were, I just would say, in German abattoirs, the Jews in fighting back against the attempt to ban it, got together, Orthodox rabbis and various others got together what are called Gutachten, which are sort of reports, informative reports of hundreds of veterinary scientists and professors throughout Europe, and also butchers who worked at the major abattoirs in major cities throughout Europe testifying. And there was not an inconsiderable number who used what they called the kosher schnitt to kill their own animals. And these are Christian butchers.
Wow.
Because they believed it ended up with better meat. You had this gigantic exsanguinous torrent that comes out, and you're not paying for lots of blood. It was also seen to be economically better for the customer. So there were non-Jews who signed on to these reports and these Gutachten, testifying that this is a very good way and painless and very rapid way of dispatching an animal. So there was that too. I mean, the story is not. I hope I made it clear, but maybe there was a lot of cooperation in places. Anti-Semitism runs like a red thread through it, but so too does cooperation and working together. I mean, the whole medieval section, which I didn't address, sees Jews are treated just terribly at that time, and yet in the meat markets, the laws which I read and looked at made me come away thinking that Jews were treated very fairly, and that the laws were designed to allow both Christian butchers and Jewish butchers to do business and to earn a living. And so they were pretty fair, actually. I think they were treated very fairly.
I think that complicated note is probably a nice place for us to pivot away from the more formal Q&A and to invite people once again into the display room to look at the objects and hopefully to Professor
Right.